I have often reflected that there is nothing quite so deceptive as a holiday with Hercule Poirot. One embarks upon such ventures with the most innocent of intentions. Visions of rest, warm skies, and gentle idleness dancing before one's eyes. One imagines sunny terraces and leisurely conversations rather than corpses, orange groves instead of interrogations. Yet fate, or perhaps Poirot's peculiar genius for attracting human drama, invariably intervenes with the most inconvenient timing. Our journey to Marrakesh had been entirely my suggestion. For weeks I had been encouraging Poirot to seek a change of air from the dreary London winter. "My dear Poirot," I had urged, "you will be quite ruined if you remain cooped up in these rooms much longer. Come to Morocco with me. Clear air, brilliant sunshine, the Atlas Mountains. It will be altogether restorative." Poirot, reclining in his favorite armchair with his hands placed in perfect symmetry upon his immaculately pressed waistcoat, had regarded me with the expression of a man asked to relocate to the moon. "You speak, mon ami Hastings, as though I were a piece of furniture requiring dusting and rearrangement. Besides," he added with a delicate shudder, "I do not care for dust, and Morocco, from all accounts, possesses dust in abundance." "The climate is wonderfully dry," I had persisted. "Excellent for the constitution." "Dust," replied Poirot with finality, "is also dry." Nevertheless, something, perhaps the persistent gloom of that January, or more likely a certain restlessness in his ever-active mind, eventually induced him to capitulate. Thus it was that we found ourselves installed at the Hotel Palais d'Orient in Marrakesh, a luxurious establishment perched on the edge of the ancient Medina, commanding spectacular views of terracotta rooftops and minarets that glowed rose gold in the afternoon sun. The setting of our drama. The hotel had attracted a most interesting collection of guests during our stay. There was Colonel Arbuthnot, a weathered veteran of the Indian frontier, with strong opinions on everything from native customs to the proper preparation of gin. Miss Daisy Larkin, an energetic American journalist whose enthusiasm for authentic experiences knew no bounds. Sir Charles and Lady Winter, he a prosperous industrialist with a booming laugh. She a nervous woman who possessed the unsettling habit of constantly twisting the rings upon her fingers. Most intriguing, however, was Monsieur Armand Delacroix, a French dealer in antiquities and oriental carpets. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, olive-skinned and perpetually smiling, yet there was something in his dark eyes that suggested depths not immediately apparent. Poirot had observed him with particular interest on several occasions. "An intelligent man," was all he would say when pressed, and intelligence, mon ami, can be employed for purposes both noble and otherwise. On our fourth evening in Marrakesh, the hotel manager had organized what he termed an authentic cultural excursion, a guided tour through the evening bazaars followed by dinner at a traditional riad. The prospect delighted our fellow guests. Lady Winter declared it positively thrilling, while Miss Larkin exclaimed that it would be simply divine and so atmospheric. Into the labyrinth we departed as the sun began its descent behind the palm groves, painting the sky in magnificent streaks of purple and gold. Our party numbered 12 souls, led by Ahmed, the hotel's dignified dragoman, resplendent in his white djellaba. As we penetrated deeper into the maze of narrow alleys that comprised the ancient souk, the familiar world of the hotel seemed to dissolve behind us. The bazaar at night possessed an almost theatrical quality. Lanterns of colored glass swung from low archways, casting pools of amber and crimson light upon the worn cobblestones. The air was thick with a symphony of scents: incense, spices, roasting meat, and the indefinable mustiness of great age. From shadowed doorways, dark eyes observed our passage, with expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation. Poirot walked somewhat apart from the group, his patent leather shoes picking their way fastidiously across the uneven stones. His hat sat at a precise angle, and his small hands were clasped behind his back in an attitude of contemplation. Yet his green eyes missed nothing. Not the whispered conversation between Ahmed and a carpet seller, not the furtive glance exchanged between two veiled women near a spice stall, not the sudden tension that seemed to grip Monsieur Delacroix when we passed a particular shop displaying ancient artifacts. "Order, Hastings," he murmured to me as we paused before a display of brass lamps and inlaid boxes. Even in apparent chaos, there is always the order, if one possesses the eyes to perceive it. Observe how each trade groups itself, the metalworkers here, the leather merchants there, the dealers in antiquities in their own quarter. Human nature arranges itself according to predictable patterns. The discovery. We had been walking for perhaps 30 minutes when our peaceful progress was shattered by a commotion ahead. Raised voices echoed off the narrow walls, and a small crowd had begun to gather around the entrance to a shop that specialized in ancient jewelry and artifacts. Ahmed frowned and pushed forward, his authoritative presence parting the growing throng of onlookers. The shop itself was little more than a cave carved into the ancient stone, its low ceiling blackened by centuries of oil lamp smoke. Glass cases lined the walls, filled with necklaces, rings, and ceremonial daggers that gleamed dully in the lamplight. Behind the counter, the proprietor, a small elderly man in a brown jalaba, stood wringing his hands, his face a mask of terror and confusion. But it was the figure on the earthen floor that commanded our horrified attention. The body lay in an unnatural posture near the back of the shop, arms flung wide, legs twisted beneath. The victim was a European man of perhaps 60 years, dressed in a linen suit that had once been white, but was now stained with dust and something far more sinister. His iron-gray hair was disheveled, his face bore the waxy pallor of death, and a thin trickle of blood had dried at the corner of his mouth. Most disturbing of all, his right hand was clenched tightly around a small object, what appeared to be a fragment of ancient pottery decorated with curious symbols. "Mon Dieu!" gasped Monsieur Delacroix, pressing forward despite Ahmed's attempts to restrain our party. "It is Michel, Gérard Michel. You know this man?" demanded Colonel Arbuthnot, his military bearing asserting itself in the crisis. "But of course, he was a dealer in antiquities from Paris. We have done business together on numerous occasions." Delacroix's face had gone quite pale beneath his olive complexion. What could have happened here? The shop owner burst into rapid Arabic, gesticulating wildly. Ahmed translated with evident reluctance. "He says the gentleman came in perhaps an hour ago, asking to see certain items. They were speaking together when suddenly the man collapsed. He swears he did nothing, that the gentleman simply fell." Enter the professionals. Within minutes, the narrow alley filled with the sound of approaching authority. Two uniformed officers of the Moroccan police forced their way through the crowd, followed by a tall, thin European in civilian dress. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, with fair hair graying at the temples and a pair of pince-nez that caught the lamplight as he surveyed the scene. "Inspector Lambert of the Sûreté," Ahmed murmured respectfully. "He coordinates with the local authorities on matters involving European nationals." Inspector Lambert's trained eye swept over the scene, pausing briefly on each member of our tourist party before settling on the corpse. His gaze lingered on the clenched hand and the pottery fragment it contained. "No one is to leave," he announced in careful English. "I require the names and details of everyone present when this incident was discovered." It was then that Poirot stepped forward with a small, precise bow. "Monsieur l'inspecteur," he said in perfect French, "permit me to introduce myself. I am Hercule Poirot." The effect was immediate and electric. Inspector Lambert's eyebrows rose, and a murmur of recognition rippled through our group. Miss Larkin actually gasped aloud. "Hercule Poirot? The detective?" Lambert's voice carried a mixture of surprise and what might have been relief. "The same, monsieur." Lambert's expression grew thoughtful. Then perhaps, Monsieur Poirot, your presence here is more than mere coincidence, for I suspect we are not dealing with a simple case of natural death. This man," he gestured toward the corpse, "is indeed Gerard Michel, as your companion identified. He was a dealer in antiquities, but also a man with many enemies. His business practices were questionable." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. "Ah, Inspector, then perhaps my little grey cells will not rust entirely in the Moroccan sun." He moved closer to the body, though he did not touch or disturb anything. Instead, he simply observed, his gaze taking in the position of the limbs, the expression on the dead man's face, the curious rigidity of the clenched hand. "You perceive something, Monsieur Poirot?" Lambert inquired. "Several things, mon ami. First, observe the deceased's shoes. They bear no dust from these streets, yet he has supposedly walked here from his hotel. Second, note the position of the body. There are no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, yet the expression on his face suggests surprise rather than the peaceful countenance of natural death. And finally," Poirot's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, "there is the matter of what he holds in his hand. That pottery fragment was not selected at random. It was placed there deliberately, either by Monsieur Michel himself or by another party." He straightened and turned to survey our little group of tourists, his penetrating gaze moving from face to face. I saw Lady Winter shiver despite the warm evening air, while Sir Charles attempted to maintain his usual bluff demeanor with limited success. Miss Larkin clutched her notebook, her journalistic instincts warring with obvious fear. Colonel Arbuthnot stood at rigid attention, but his weathered face showed strain. And Monsieur Delacroix. Delacroix was staring at the pottery fragment with an expression I could not quite interpret. "Inspector," Poirot continued quietly, "I suspect we have here not merely a death in exotic surroundings, but a carefully orchestrated murder. And the murderer, I would venture to suggest, is almost certainly among our present company." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and fear through the assembled group. In the flickering lamplight of the ancient bazaar, surrounded by the whispers of curious onlookers and the weight of centuries-old stones, our innocent holiday had transformed into something far more sinister. "Once again, Hastings," Poirot murmured to me as Inspector Lambert began organizing the removal of the body. "We find ourselves in a little closed circle. It is most inconvenient for a holiday." His eyes, bright with the unmistakable gleam of intellectual challenge, surveyed the narrow shop, the nervous faces of our companions, and the mysterious fragment of pottery that had accompanied Gerard Michel into death. Whatever secrets lay hidden in the ancient stones of Marrakesh, I knew that Hercule Poirot would not rest until every one of them had been dragged into the light. We were conducted back through the labyrinthine streets to the hotel in a procession that bore no resemblance to our earlier festive expedition. The weight of suspicion hung over our little group like the heavy evening air, and I noticed how our party had unconsciously rearranged itself. No longer the casual clustering of tourists, but the careful spacing of individuals who had suddenly become wary of one another. Inspector Lambert commandeered the hotel's private salon, a magnificent room overlooking the central courtyard where a fountain played among orange trees. The contrast between the serene beauty of the setting and the grim nature of our business struck me as particularly incongruous. Persian carpets covered the marble floors, brass lanterns cast warm pools of light, and the air carried the sweet scent of jasmine, yet we might as well have been in the most sordid of police stations. Poirot selected a chair in the corner from which he could observe the entire room, settling himself with his characteristic precision. His hands were folded over the head of his ebony cane, and to the casual observer he might have appeared to be dozing. I knew better. Those green eyes missed nothing, not the nervous twist of Lady Winter's rings, not the way Colonel Arbuthnot's jaw tightened when he thought no one was watching. not the calculating glances that Monsieur Delacroix cast toward the door as if measuring distances. "Before we begin the formal questioning," Lambert announced, consulting his notebook, "I must inform you that the preliminary examination of Monsieur Michel suggests this was not a natural death. The medical examiner will provide final confirmation, but certain indicators point to poisoning, likely something fast-acting and difficult to detect without proper analysis." Lady Winter gave a small cry and pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Sir Charles moved protectively closer to his wife, his usual bluff demeanor replaced by genuine concern. Poisoning. Miss Larkin's journalistic instincts overcame her shock. "But how? When?" "We were all together during the tour." "That, mademoiselle, is precisely what we must determine," Lambert replied. "The timeline is crucial. Monsieur Michel was seen alive at the hotel at approximately 5:30 this evening. His body was discovered at 7:15. During those 105 minutes, someone in this room had the opportunity to administer a fatal dose of poison." Poirot's voice came softly from his corner. "Inspector, if I may, there is also the matter of the pottery fragment found clutched in the victim's hand. Such an object does not arrive there by accident. Either Monsieur Michel grasped it deliberately as he died, or his murderer placed it there for reasons we have yet to understand." "Quite right, Monsieur Poirot." Lambert turned to address Delacroix directly. "Monsieur, as you identified the deceased and admitted to knowing him professionally, we shall begin with you. Please describe your relationship with Gerard Michel in detail." Delacroix straightened in his chair, his olive complexion pale in the lamplight. "Michel and I were competitors, Inspector, but not enemies. The antiquities trade is a small world. We encountered each other frequently at auctions and private sales. Our relationship was professional." "Professional," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Yet when you saw his body, you appeared considerably more distressed than one might expect from a mere business acquaintance. A flicker of something, fear, guilt, crossed Delacroix's features. The sight of death is always disturbing, Monsieur Poirot, regardless of one's relationship to the deceased." "Indeed. And when did you last speak with Monsieur Michel before this evening?" 3 days ago, here at the hotel. We encountered each other in the lobby and exchanged pleasantries. He seemed agitated, excited. He mentioned that he was pursuing a particular acquisition, something he had been seeking for many years." Lambert leaned forward. "Did he specify the nature of this acquisition?" Michel was always secretive about his dealings, but I gathered it was something significant, perhaps a major archaeological find. He spoke of completing a collection and mentioned that certain parties would pay handsomely for authentication. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Ah, authentication. A delicate matter in your profession, n'est-ce pas? The difference between a priceless artifact and an expensive forgery often rests upon a single expert's opinion." "Precisely," Delacroix agreed, then seemed to realize the implications of his words. "But I had no involvement in Michel's current business, whatever it might have been." "And your own presence in Marrakesh," Lambert continued. "I make this journey twice yearly to purchase carpets and jewelry for my clients in Paris. I can provide you with a complete itinerary of my appointments and the names of merchants I have dealt with." Lambert made notes while Poirot observed the reactions of the other suspects. "I noticed that Colonel Arbuthnot had grown increasingly rigid during Delacroix's testimony, while Miss Larkin scribbled furiously in her notebook. Sir Charles whispered something to his wife, who merely nodded without looking at him. "Now then," Lambert continued, "let us establish your movements this evening. After we left the hotel at 6 o'clock, where did you go?" "I became separated from the main group almost immediately," Delacroix replied. "The Bazaar is a maze, and I was drawn to examine some silver work in a shop near the entrance. I spent perhaps 20 minutes there, speaking with the proprietor about techniques and pricing." "The name of this proprietor?" "Abdul something. I'm afraid I didn't catch his full name, but he will remember me. We discussed the difference between Moroccan and Yemeni silversmithing at some length." Poirot's voice came again, deceptively mild. How curious that a man familiar with Marrakesh should become separated so quickly from his party. One might almost think it was intentional. Delacroix's composure slipped slightly. I resent the implication, Miss Poirot. I'm a serious collector, not a tourist seeking souvenirs. When I see something of interest, I investigate. But of course, Poirot murmured. And during your investigation of silverwork, did you happen to notice Monsieur Michel in the vicinity? A long pause. I may have glimpsed him near the antiquities quarter, but I paid little attention. As I said, we were not close associates. Lambert looked up from his notes. Yet you seemed to know exactly where to find him when the commotion arose. You reached the shop very quickly for someone who claimed to be examining silver at the opposite end of the bazaar. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. I saw Poirot nod almost imperceptibly, filing away this inconsistency for future reference. Inspector, Poirot said quietly, before we continue, might I suggest you speak with Hassan, the young concierge? I understand from Ahmed that he was seen speaking with Monsieur Michel in the hotel lobby earlier this evening. It would be instructive to learn the subject of their conversation. As Lambert dispatched an officer to locate Hassan, I caught Poirot's eye. His expression told me that already in these first few minutes of questioning, several threads of the mystery had begun to emerge. The pottery fragment, Michel's secret acquisition, Delacroix's convenient separation from the group. Each element was being catalogued by those remarkable little grey cells. But it was the atmosphere in the room that struck me most forcibly. The fear was palpable, but it was not the simple fear of innocent people caught in tragic circumstances. It was the complex, layered fear of individuals who harbored secrets. Secrets that murder had a way of dragging into the harsh light of investigation. Hassan entered the salon with the hesitant steps of a man walking toward his own execution. The young concierge's white jacket was immaculate as always, but his hands betrayed his nervousness, twisting constantly at the brass buttons. His dark eyes darted from face to face before settling on the floor, as though he found the Persian carpet patterns more reassuring than human scrutiny. Inspector Lambert gestured to a chair near the fountain window. Please, Hassan, we simply wish to understand your conversation with Monsieur Michel this evening. You are not accused of anything. The reassurance seemed to have little effect. Hassan perched on the edge of the chair like a bird ready for flight, his gaze flickering briefly toward Monsieur Delacroix before returning to his lap. Poirot leaned forward with the gentle manner he reserved for the frightened and the innocent. Come, mon petit. You have nothing to fear from the truth. Tell us about this note you gave to Monsieur Michel. It came just before 6 o'clock. Hassan began, his voice barely above a whisper. A boy from the Medina brought it, one of the street children who carry messages for a few dirhams. He said it was urgent, that it must reach the French gentleman immediately. And you gave it to Monsieur Michel? Oui, monsieur. He was at the desk asking if there were any messages. When I handed him the note, he read it there, standing before me. His face. Hassan swallowed hard. His face became very red, and his hands shook like an old man's. Lambert made careful notes while Poirot observed the reactions of our assembled suspects. I noticed that Delacroix had gone quite pale, while Colonel Arbuthnot sat with military rigidity, his jaw clenched tight. Did Monsieur Michel say anything after reading this note? Poirot inquired. He said, so it is tonight then. And he asked me how to find the shop of Ben Salah in the antiquities souk. I told him it was near the northern entrance, past the carpet sellers. He left immediately, so agitated he nearly forgot his hat. This note, did you see what became of it? Hassan's flush deepened with shame. Monsieur Michel tore it into pieces and threw them in the wastebasket. But I was curious. After he left, I tried to read the pieces. Some words I could make out. Fragment, dangerous, final price, and the name Ben Salah at the bottom. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest, while Inspector Lambert scribbled furiously. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured. "And have you seen Monsieur Michel speaking with anyone else from our hotel during his stay?" Again that nervous glance toward Delacroix. "3 nights ago, in the courtyard. He was arguing with Monsieur Delacroix. Their voices were raised, something about authenticity and prices. I could not help but overhear." All eyes turned to the French antiquities dealer, whose composure finally cracked. It was a professional disagreement, nothing more. Michel questioned the provenance of a piece I had acquired. Such disputes are common in our business. "Yet you failed to mention this earlier," Lambert observed coldly. Before Delacroix could respond, Poirot dismissed Hassan with a gentle nod. The young man fled gratefully, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with suspicion and unspoken accusations. "Now then, Colonel Arbuthnot," Lambert continued, turning to the military man, "I require a detailed account of your movements this evening." The colonel's weathered face remained impassive. "Left with the group at 6, became separated almost immediately. These bazaars are confounded mazes. Spent time examining some metalwork near the entrance before rejoining the others just before the commotion." "You were alone for how long?" "Perhaps 30 minutes. I have some knowledge of Eastern craftsmanship from my years in India. When I see quality work, I investigate." Poirot's voice came softly from his corner. "How curious, Colonel, that a man of your military precision should become so thoroughly lost. One might almost think the separation was intentional." Arbuthnot's jaw tightened. "I resent the implication, Monsieur Poirot." "No implication, merely observation. Tell me, during your service in India, did you perhaps encounter the antiquities trade? The subcontinent is rich with archaeological treasures, n'est-ce pas?" "My duties were military, not archaeological," the colonel replied stiffly, but I caught the slight tremor in his voice. Miss Larkin suddenly leaned forward, her journalistic instincts overcoming discretion. "Colonel, I couldn't help but notice you seemed to recognize Monsieur Michel's name immediately when it was mentioned, yet you claim never to have met him." "One hears names in certain circles," Arbuthnot muttered. "Ah," Poirot said thoughtfully. "But you are not a professional dealer, Colonel. You are merely a collector of military artifacts. How would such a name reach your ears unless—" He left the sentence delicately unfinished. The silence stretched taut as a wire. In that moment, watching the play of emotions across each suspect's face, I realized that we were not dealing with a simple crime of passion or greed. Something far more complex was unfolding, a web of connections reaching back through years, perhaps decades, touching upon the shadowy world of antiquities, dealing where authenticity and legality often blurred into dangerous ambiguity. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "tomorrow we must examine not merely the scene of the crime, but the very foundations upon which this drama has been built. For I suspect that the fragment clutched in Monsieur Michel's hand is not merely evidence, it is the key to understanding why he had to die." The morning sun cast long shadows across the hotel's breakfast terrace, but the golden light could not dispel the atmosphere of suspicion that had settled over our little party like a shroud. Sleep had been elusive for most of us, and the faces gathered around the scattered tables bore the telltale signs of restless nights and troubled consciences. Poirot appeared at precisely 8 o'clock, immaculate as always despite the circumstances. His morning routine remained unaltered by murder. Patent leather shoes gleaming, mustaches waxed to perfection, and his small hands arranging his breakfast with geometric precision. He selected a table near the fountain where the morning light fell across his coffee cup at exactly the angle he preferred. "The night has been most instructive, Hastings," he murmured as I joined him. "I've been corresponding with Inspector Lambert, reviewing the preliminary findings. Monsieur Michel's hotel room contained documents most revealing, letters, receipts, photographs. The life of an antiquities dealer, it seems, is never simple." Before I could press for details, Lady Winter appeared in the doorway. Without her husband for once, She seemed smaller, more fragile. The nervous twisting of her rings had become almost constant, and her eyes bore the reddened evidence of a sleepless night. Poirot rose with courtly precision. "Madame, please, will you not join us? I perceive you carry a burden that grows heavier with each passing hour. Perhaps it would be wise to share this weight before it becomes unbearable." She sank into the offered chair with visible relief. "You see too much, Monsieur Poirot. Charles means well, but he thinks silence protects me. It only makes everything worse." "Then speak, madame. I assure you, discretion is among my few virtues." Lady Winter's hands stilled for the first time since I had known her. I knew Gerard Michel. Not well, but we had encountered each other before. 10 years ago in Cairo during our wedding journey. Michel approached us at our hotel with what he claimed was a genuine scarab from a royal tomb. Charles paid handsomely for it. He was so proud, displayed it to everyone in London, until a museum curator examined it 3 years later and declared it an excellent forgery. The humiliation was considerable. It nearly destroyed Charles socially. But when I saw Michel here, her voice dropped to a whisper. I confronted him privately 2 nights ago. I demanded he return the money, threatened to expose his practices. He laughed at me, Monsieur Poirot. Then he revealed that he knew about my past, things that would destroy my marriage if Charles learned them. Blackmail, then. Not for money. He wanted silence. He said he was pursuing the greatest acquisition of his career and could not afford scandal. He needed assurance that Charles would never recognize him, never cause a scene. She pressed her handkerchief to her lips. I was not always Lady Winter. I was Daisy Marsh, a chorus girl in Cairo. If Charles discovered the truth. Poirot studied her with those penetrating green eyes. Yet you tell me this now, knowing it places you under grave suspicion. Because I did not kill him. I hated him, yes, but I never had the opportunity. I remained with the main group throughout the evening tour. Miss Larkin can confirm it. At that moment, Sir Charles himself appeared, his usually ruddy complexion pale with something between anger and fear. "Eleanor, what are you doing here? What have you told them?" The confrontation between husband and wife was interrupted by Inspector Lambert's arrival. "Forgive the intrusion, but we must return to the scene. The medical examiner's report has arrived, and there are developments that require immediate attention." The return to Ben Salah's shop. The drive through the awakening city was accomplished in tense silence. The morning bustle of the souk seemed indifferent to the tragedy in its midst. Donkeys laden with goods, merchants arranging their wares, tourists already beginning their explorations of the labyrinthine streets. At Ben Salah's shop, the yellow police tape struck a jarring note against the ancient stone. Inside, the air remained heavy with dust and the indefinable weight of recent death. The chalk outline on the floor served as a stark reminder of mortality. "The medical examiner confirms our suspicions," Lambert announced. "Monsieur Michel died from a concentrated dose of aconitine, extracted from monk's hood. It was administered orally, likely in a beverage consumed immediately before death." "Aconitine?" Poirot murmured thoughtfully. "A poison with considerable literary precedent. It suggests our murderer possesses both knowledge and a certain theatrical sensibility." He moved immediately to examine the display cases, his trained eye cataloguing their contents. "Observe, Hastings, here, on this shelf. A space where something recently stood. The dust pattern is quite distinct." The elderly shopkeeper, Ben Salah, trembled as he answered Lambert's questions through an interpreter. "It was an amphora, Inspector. Roman period, very valuable. The French gentleman, Michel. He purchased it yesterday evening. Paid in gold coins, very heavy." "And where is this amphora now?" "Broken, Effendi. When the gentleman fell, the vase shattered. The police took the pieces." Poirot's interest sharpened considerably. "Tell me about the tea you served, Monsieur Michel. It is customary, n'est-ce pas?" "But of course, always I offer tea to serious customers. I prepared it in the back room, brought it on the brass tray, but I left the pot on the counter for a moment to fetch sugar from the storeroom. When I returned, he gestured helplessly. And during this time, were there other customers in the shop? Ben Salah's eyes widened as he recalled the events. Many people, Effendi. A tall European gentleman examining the ceremonial daggers, very particular about the workmanship. A lady with a notebook asking many questions about prices. And another man, dark-skinned like a Frenchman, very nervous, watching from the doorway. Lambert and I exchanged significant glances. The descriptions matched Colonel Arbuthnot, Miss Larkin, and Monsieur Delacroix with uncomfortable precision. Poirot approached the brass tray that still held the fatal teapot and cups. Leaning close, he inhaled delicately. "Bitter almonds," he whispered, faint but unmistakable beneath the mint. "Our murderer came prepared, Hastings. This was no crime of passion or opportunity. It was a carefully planned execution." As we prepared to leave, Poirot paused at a rack of postcards outside the shop. He selected one depicting ancient Roman ruins and studied it with intense concentration. "You see, mon ami," he said quietly, "the past is never truly buried. It waits, patient as these stones, for someone to uncover its secrets, and sometimes what they discover is worth killing for." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the ancient stones. But as we made our way back through the winding streets, I could not shake the feeling that we were walking through a maze far more complex than the physical labyrinth of the souk. A maze of human motives, hidden connections, and deadly secrets that stretched back through years and across continents. "The pattern grows clearer, Hastings," Poirot observed, as our car navigated the narrow streets. "We have established method and opportunity, but motive, that remains beautifully complex. For I suspect that nearly everyone in our little circle possessed compelling reasons for wishing Monsieur Michel permanently silenced." The afternoon heat pressed down upon the hotel like a suffocating blanket, but inside the private salon, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Inspector Lambert arranged the fragments of the shattered amphora upon a white linen cloth. The ancient pottery pieces formed a macabre puzzle, their surfaces decorated with faded figures engaged in what appeared to be some ceremonial procession. Poirot examined each fragment with his magnifying glass, his concentration absolute. "Most revealing, Inspector," he murmured, tapping one particular shard with his pencil. "Observe the workmanship. The style suggests 2nd century Roman, yet certain details trouble me. This glaze composition appears distinctly modern, and these decorative elements are too precise, too perfectly rendered." "You're suggesting it's a forgery?" Lambert inquired, leaning closer. "Perhaps, but more intriguing still." Poirot indicated a section where modern adhesive was clearly visible. "Someone has recently altered this piece. A painted section was removed, then replaced. And on that removable section, traces of ink remain despite attempts to wash it clean." Lambert consulted his notes. "Our laboratory managed to recover 2 legible words from the writing, Kandahar and inventory. There's also a partial date, want ishate. The context appears military in nature. The web of connections." At that moment, Miss Daisy Larkin entered the salon, her usual vivacity replaced by an expression of profound weariness. She carried her ever-present notebook, but her hands trembled as she took the offered seat near Poirot. "Inspector Lambert requested my presence," she said quietly, "though I fear my usefulness to your investigation may be complicated." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. "Complicated, mademoiselle? In what manner?" Miss Larkin's composure wavered. "Because I haven't been entirely truthful about my connection to Gerard Michel. I knew him not personally, but through his professional activities. My father was Professor Harold Larkin, an archaeologist who worked extensively in North Africa." The name seemed to resonate in the room. Lambert made a note, while Poirot leaned forward with renewed attention. "Your father died 3 years ago under professionally unfortunate circumstances," Poirot observed gently. "There were accusations regarding the improper removal of artifacts from excavation sites. Those accusations destroyed him." Miss Larkin's voice rose with long-suppressed passion. "My father devoted his life to understanding the past. He was brilliant, meticulous, honest. But Gérard Michel authenticated 3 Roman figurines found in my father's possession, declaring them genuine artifacts from the Timgad excavation. The university used Michel's testimony to dismiss my father, to strip him of his position and reputation. And you believe this authentication was fraudulent?" I confronted Michel about it that evening in the Bazaar. I followed him to Ben Salah's shop and demanded he admit his authentication was false. But he didn't deny it. He seemed almost proud. He said authentication was an art, that truth was whatever the highest bidder wanted it to be. Poirot exchanged a significant glance with Lambert. Did Monsieur Michel elaborate on this philosophy? "He said my father had been collateral damage in a much larger game, that if I knew the full story, I would understand. And then he said something strange, that my father had discovered something he shouldn't have, that the pottery told a story certain people didn't want told." The military connection. Before Poirot could respond, a commotion erupted in the hotel lobby. Colonel Arbuthnot's voice, raised in military outrage, echoed through the marble halls. "I demand to speak with the British consul. This is outrageous." We emerged to find the colonel confronting 2 uniformed officers, while Lambert held a small leather satchel. Inside, nestled among shaving brushes and military medals, lay a glass vial labeled "Tincture of Aconite." "Found hidden beneath the floorboards of the colonel's wardrobe," Lambert announced with satisfaction, "along with these documents." He produced a manila envelope containing what appeared to be military correspondence and inventory sheets. The letterhead bore the insignia of a frontier regiment, and several documents were signed with Arbuthnot's name. "The Kandahar connection becomes clear," Lambert continued. "Colonel Arbuthnot was indeed stationed on the northwest frontier in the late 1880s, attached to an intelligence unit responsible for cataloguing seized artifacts. The controversial raid on a fortified compound near Kandahar in 1889 resulted in allegations, never proven, that valuable antiquities went missing between the field inventory and official shipment to the British Museum." Arbuthnot's face had progressed through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. "I've never seen that bottle in my life. It's been planted. As for Kandahar, yes, I was there, but I was never accused of impropriety." "Yet Michel knew of these irregularities," Lambert pressed. "He threatened to expose not just you, but your commanding officer, a decorated man whose reputation would have been destroyed." The colonel's shoulders sagged. Michel was a parasite who fed on old scandals. "Yes, there were irregularities at Kandahar. War creates chaos, and some artifacts disappeared. But I was a junior officer following orders. When Michel approached me, with his insinuations, I told him the matter was closed. The false resolution." As the colonel was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence, a palpable sense of relief settled over the hotel. The case appeared solved. Motive, opportunity, and the murder weapon all pointing to one man. Even I felt the tension beginning to dissipate. "A classic case," Lambert declared with satisfaction. "The old soldier protecting his regiment's honor, pushed too far by blackmail. The poison, likely acquired during his travels. Everything fits perfectly." "Does it?" Poirot's voice was dangerously quiet. He was examining the glass vial through his pocket lens, turning it slowly in the afternoon light. "Tell me, Inspector, does a man who hides poison beneath floorboards leave the label so conveniently intact? Does a military officer, trained in strategy and discipline, carry out an execution in a crowded shop where he is known to be present?" "Criminals make mistakes, Monsieur Poirot." "Amateurs make mistakes," Poirot corrected. But this crime, the precise timing, the sophisticated method, the careful misdirection, suggests a professional mind. Colonel Arbuthnot, for all his bluster, is a man of direct action, not subtle machinations. The overlooked detail. Poirot turned to Miss Larkin, who had been observing the proceedings with the sharp eye of a trained journalist. "Mademoiselle, you were present in Ben Salah's shop that evening. Your professional habits of observation may have recorded details others missed." She consulted her notebook, flipping through pages covered with shorthand. "I remember the chaos, the cramped space, the colonel examining those ceremonial knives, Monsieur Delacroix behaving strangely, not looking at merchandise, but watching the back room where the shopkeeper prepared tea. And the tea service itself." Miss Larkin frowned in concentration. "Now that you mention it, there were 3 cups on the brass tray, but only Michel and Ben Salah were drinking. Who was the 3rd cup for?" Poirot's smile was sudden and brilliant. "Précisément, the 3rd cup, the detail that does not fit the official picture. In a shop where only 2 men were present, why prepare 3 cups of tea?" He rose from his chair with renewed energy, his earlier contemplative mood vanishing like morning mist. "Inspector Lambert, while you celebrate your victory, I fear the true murderer remains at liberty. The arrest of Colonel Arbuthnot is precisely what our criminal intended, a convenient scapegoat to satisfy official justice while the real perpetrator slips away." Lambert's expression darkened. "You're suggesting Arbuthnot was framed?" "I am suggesting, mon ami, that we have been invited to look in one direction while the truth stands elsewhere. The poison in the colonel's room, the convenient military documents, even the Kandahar connection, all arranged with theatrical precision to create the perfect false. Solution." Poirot moved toward the garden doors, his patent leather shoes clicking against the marble with purposeful rhythm. "Come, Hastings, we must return to the Cirque immediately. Not to Ben Salah's shop, but to verify certain alibis that I suspect will prove as fragile as the pottery fragments in Michel's hand." As we stepped into the blazing afternoon sun, I realized that for Poirot, the arrest of Colonel Arbuthnot represented not the solution to our mystery, but merely the completion of the first act in a far more complex drama. The game, as he often reminded me, was still very much afoot. "The pieces move according to a pattern, Hastings," he murmured as we made our way through the hotel's ornate entrance. "But they move according to a design that only one person controls, and that person has been watching us very carefully indeed, ensuring that we see exactly what they wish us to see. No more, no less." The ancient stones of Marrakesh seemed to shimmer in the heat, holding their secrets as they had for centuries. But I knew that Hercule Poirot would not rest until every one of those secrets had been dragged into the unforgiving light of truth. The souk at midday pulsed with renewed energy as merchants emerged from their afternoon respite. Poirot moved through the narrow alleys with purposeful precision, his patent leather shoes navigating the uneven stones, while his keen eyes catalogued every detail of our surroundings. The Witness Trail. Our first destination was the silver merchant, where Delacroix claimed to have spent 20 minutes examining filigree work. The proprietor, a dignified man with henned fingers, greeted us with professional courtesy, but his testimony proved illuminating. "Ah yes, the French gentleman," he confirmed through our interpreter. "He came yesterday evening, spoke knowledgeably of Yemeni techniques, but he stayed only 5 minutes, perhaps less. He seemed very distracted, constantly checking his watch and looking toward the street." 5 minutes, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Not 20 as he claimed. And after he left your establishment, he walked quickly toward the street of the dyers, Effendi. I remember because he nearly collided with a donkey carrying wool bales. From there, we traced Delacroix's actual movements through conversations with other merchants. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. A man who had systematically lied about his whereabouts, creating gaps in his timeline that coincided perfectly with the window of opportunity for murder. The Potter's Revelation. Following a lead that had nagged at Poirot's methodical mind, we sought out a small workshop tucked beneath a crumbling archway in the craftsman's quarter. Here, an elderly potter worked at restoring damaged ceramics, his bench covered with fragments and specialized tools. The breakthrough came when Poirot, speaking in flawless Arabic, inquired about recent commissions involving pottery, fragments. After some gentle persuasion and the discreet exchange of banknotes, the craftsman's story emerged. The French gentleman, Michel, he came 3 days ago with pieces of an old amphora. Very specific instructions, Effendi. I was to create exact duplicates, but with modifications. Some pieces were to contain hidden compartments for documents. Others were to be marked with symbols that would appear ancient but could be recognized by those who knew what to seek. "How many sets did you create?" Poirot asked with barely contained excitement. 3 complete sets. The French gentleman paid handsomely and emphasized absolute secrecy. He said lives depended on my discretion. The implications struck me immediately. 1 set was found with Michel's body, but where are the other 2? One was collected 2 days ago by a European woman, well-dressed, very nervous. She examined each piece carefully. The other... The potter paused, consulting a ledger. This morning, an English gentleman, older, with expensive clothes, he paid in gold sovereigns. The expanding web. As we made our way back through the labyrinthine streets, Poirot's mind was clearly racing through the implications. You perceive it now, Hastings. We are not dealing with a simple murder, but with an elaborate conspiracy involving forged artifacts designed to conceal and transport sensitive information. But who is behind it all? That, mon ami, is what we must determine tonight. For I suspect our murderer believes themselves safe behind the Colonel's arrest. They will be unprepared for the psychological pressure I intend to apply. The dinner gambit. That evening's dinner proved to be a masterclass in Poirot's psychological methodology. The dining room's elegant atmosphere provided a stark contrast to the tension that crackled between our assembled suspects. Colonel Arbuthnot's empty chair served as a constant reminder of the supposed resolution to our case. Poirot regaled the table with stories from his previous cases, but his chosen topic was far from random. "The psychology of the poisoner fascinates me," he declared, his green eyes moving systematically from face to face. Unlike the man who strikes in passion with knife or pistol, the poisoner must plan meticulously. They require not only scientific knowledge but supreme arrogance, the belief that they can control life and death without detection. Monsieur Delacroix shifted uncomfortably, his fork clattering against his plate. "Surely, Monsieur Poirot, with the Colonel's arrest, such speculation is merely academic?" "Is it?" Poirot's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. "I find the evidence against the Colonel almost too perfect. Real life is untidy, monsieur. It rarely presents us with conveniently labeled poison bottles and incriminating documents wrapped in neat packages." Lady Winter's voice trembled as she asked, "Then you believe Colonel Arbuthnot is innocent?" "I believe someone in this hotel is exceptionally clever," Poirot replied carefully. "Someone who understands human nature, how quickly we accept obvious solutions because they comfort us. But this person has made one crucial error." The silence that descended was thick with apprehension. Even the waiters seemed to pause in their duties. "They forgot," Poirot continued softly, "that objects have memories. A pottery fragment, a discarded note, a 3rd teacup. These things speak to those who listen carefully. The physical evidence." Later that evening, Miss Larkin appeared at my door, her face pale with fear and determination. "Mr. Hastings, I must speak with Monsieur Poirot immediately. There's something I didn't tell Inspector Lambert, something I thought unimportant until tonight." We found Poirot in the salon, arranging playing cards with his characteristic precision. He listened intently as Miss Larkin revealed her crucial observation. "When I was in Ben Salah's shop before the murder, I saw him preparing the tea service. He took a small packet from his pocket and added something to the pot. I assumed it was additional mint or sugar, but the packet was distinctive. Blue paper, folded in a very specific pharmaceutical manner. Poirot leaned forward with sharp interest. "And this blue paper, you have seen it elsewhere?" "Yes. Later, as I was leaving the hotel for dinner, I saw Monsieur Delacroix throwing something into the courtyard fountain. It looked exactly like a crumpled piece of blue paper." Within minutes, we were in the moonlit courtyard. Poirot, heedless of his immaculate trousers, waded into the shallow fountain waters. After several tense minutes of searching, he emerged triumphant with a sodden, crumpled ball of blue paper. Back in the salon's bright light, he carefully unfolded the wet paper. Faint writing remained visible. "Pharmacie Centrale, Paris, tincture of aconite." The pattern revealed. "So," Poirot whispered, his voice filled with grim satisfaction, "the poison travelled not from India with the Colonel, but from Paris with our antiquities dealer. The question that remains is why frame the Colonel so elaborately?" He began pacing the room, his mind working through the complex web of motives and opportunities. Because the Colonel provided the perfect distraction. His Kandahar history, his volatile temperament, his connection to the antiquities world, all made him an ideal scapegoat. But the real motive lies deeper, in that third teacup and the conversation that preceded the poisoning. Poirot stopped pacing and faced us directly. "We are dealing with a conspiracy that spans decades, my friends. Michel was not merely a dealer in antiquities. He was a keeper of secrets, a man who traded in information as much as artifacts. The pottery fragments were his filing system, each piece containing or pointing to evidence that could destroy reputations and lives." "But who killed him?" I pressed. "Someone who discovered that Michel's greatest acquisition was not an ancient artifact, but modern evidence of their own past crimes. Someone who realized that silence could only be purchased with blood." His expression grew grave. "Tomorrow, we shall gather all our players for the final act, for I know now not only who committed this murder, but why they believed they had no choice." As we prepared to retire, the weight of the coming revelation hung heavy in the air. The false security of the Colonel's arrest had been thoroughly shattered, replaced by the chilling certainty that a murderer of exceptional cunning still moved among us. Someone who had smiled at dinner while plotting destruction, who had watched our investigation with the confidence of a chess master moving pieces on a board. But Hercule Poirot had his own game to play, and tomorrow would bring the final, decisive moves. The morning brought an ominous development that shattered any illusion of safety within the hotel's elegant walls. I was awakened before dawn by urgent knocking, and found Hassan standing in the corridor, his face pale with terror despite his obvious relief at being alive. "Monsieur Hastings," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder, "someone tried to poison Monsieur Delacroix's morning coffee. I noticed something wrong with the color, the way it settled. I brought it immediately to Monsieur Poirot." The second attempt. In the salon, Poirot stood examining a coffee cup with his magnifying glass, while Inspector Lambert consulted with a uniformed officer. The atmosphere was electric with tension. The false security of Colonel Arbuthnot's arrest had been thoroughly shattered. "Arsenic," Lambert announced grimly, holding up a small evidence bag containing white powder. Crude compared to the sophisticated aconitine used on Michel, but equally deadly in this concentration. Poirot set down his glass and turned to address the assembled group with unusual gravity. "This attempt tells us several important things. First, our murderer grows desperate enough to risk exposure through a second crime. Second, they believe Monsieur Delacroix possesses dangerous knowledge. And third, they are still among us, watching our every move." Delacroix himself appeared moments later, summoned by the commotion. When informed of his narrow escape, his usual composure cracked entirely. His olive complexion turned ashen, and his hands trembled as he sank into the nearest chair, But who would want to? Why would anyone? He struggled to form coherent thoughts. Perhaps, Poirot suggested gently, because you know more about Gérard Michel than you have admitted. The time for partial truths has passed, monsieur. A second life hangs in the balance. The web of deception unravels. Under Poirot's patient questioning, the truth began to emerge like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Delacroix's relationship with Michel had been far more complex than mere business rivalry. We were partners once, he admitted miserably, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. Not officially, but in practice. Michel had connections throughout North Africa and the Middle East, ways to move objects across borders without official scrutiny. I provided the European buyers and the authentication services. Authentication of genuine pieces or forgeries? Poirot inquired. Both, Delacroix whispered. The line became increasingly blurred. A piece might be genuine but illegally excavated. Or it might be a modern creation passed off as ancient. Michel didn't care. He said the past belonged to whoever could claim it most convincingly. The revelation sent ripples of shock through our assembled group. Miss Larkin stepped forward, her journalistic instincts overcoming her fear. "The figurines found in my father's possession," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "You authenticated them, didn't you? You helped destroy my father's reputation." Delacroix's silence was answer enough. The Kandahar connection. "And the Kandahar artifacts?" Poirot pressed relentlessly. Michel acquired several pieces through intermediaries after the incident. They were genuine antiquities, but their provenance was impossibly compromised. We sold them to private collectors who asked no questions about origins, including Colonel Arbuthnot. "No," Delacroix exclaimed. "The colonel was never a buyer. He was a source. Michel said Arbuthnot had been present during the original seizure, that he possessed documentation about what really happened. But the colonel refused all approaches, claimed military honor prevented him from discussing the matter. This revelation cast the colonel's situation in an entirely new light. Rather than being a guilty participant, he appeared to be another potential victim of Michel's schemes. The psychological game. Sir Charles Winter chose this moment to step forward, his usual bluff demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Inspector Lambert, I must make a confession. My business dealings have not been entirely conventional. Gérard Michel was one of several intermediaries through whom I acquired pieces for my collection." Lady Winter moved to her husband's side, her face a mask of resignation. "Charles refused Michel's demands for influence and silence. That's when Michel threatened to expose my background, not for money, but to force Charles' cooperation through personal humiliation." Poirot observed these revelations with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens. "So we established that Michel held leverage over multiple individuals. Delacroix through their criminal partnership, Sir Charles through business connections, Lady Winter through personal secrets, Miss Larkin through her father's destroyed reputation, even Colonel Arbuthnot through the Kandahar documentation. Any of them could have killed him," Lambert observed. "Indeed," Poirot agreed. "But only one possessed the specific combination of knowledge, opportunity, and psychological ruthlessness required. Only one understood Michel's documentation system using the pottery fragments. Only one knew exactly which piece of evidence Michel carried that evening. The hidden evidence." At that moment, Hassan reappeared, carrying a small wooden box he had discovered hidden in the hotel's garden shed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay what appeared to be the missing third set of pottery fragments. Poirot examined them with reverent care, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to the casual observer. "Remarkable," he murmured. "These fragments contain not ancient decorations, but modern markings, a coded system of information storage." He pointed to tiny scratches along one fragment's rim. "These marks correspond to numbers and letters, bank accounts, dates, transaction records. Michel's entire criminal enterprise documented in a form that appeared to be mere archaeological specimens. So the pottery was his filing system, Lambert realized. More than that, Inspector. It was his insurance policy and his death warrant. The trap springs. Poirot rose from his examination of the evidence, his green eyes blazing with intellectual triumph. The murderer believed that by eliminating Michel and framing Colonel Arbuthnot, they could erase the past, but they made one crucial error. They assumed that destroying the pottery would destroy the evidence. He moved to the center of the room, commanding absolute attention. What they failed to realize is that Michel was too clever to keep all his secrets in one place. The fragments we found with his body were decoys, copies created to mislead. The real evidence was hidden elsewhere, waiting to be discovered. The silence that followed was profound. Every face in the room bore the weight of secrets, but one face showed something more, the dawning realization that their carefully constructed deception was crumbling. "Tonight at 8 o'clock, Poirot announced with quiet authority. "We shall gather in this salon for the final revelation. I shall present not only the identity of Michel's murderer, but the complete solution to this conspiracy that spans decades and reaches into the highest levels of society." The final gambit. As the suspects were escorted to their rooms under discreet surveillance, Poirot turned to me with an expression of grim satisfaction. "The trap is set, Hastings. Our murderer now faces an impossible choice. Flee and confirm their guilt, or remain and face exposure. Either way, justice will be served." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hotel's ancient stones, but those shadows seemed to carry the weight of secrets finally coming to light. Somewhere within these elegant walls, a murderer was contemplating their final, desperate moves in a game that Hercule Poirot had been orchestrating. From the very beginning, the pieces were all in position. Tomorrow would bring the checkmate that would end this deadly affair in the sands of Marrakesh. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Hotel Palais d'Orient as the appointed hour approached. The building seemed to hold its breath, as if the ancient stones themselves sensed the approaching denouement of our deadly drama. Through the corridors, conversations died to whispers when footsteps approached, and even the servants moved with unusual quiet, as though afraid to disturb the delicate balance of justice and revelation. Poirot spent these final hours in what appeared to be complete repose, seated in the shaded courtyard beside the fountain. A volume of Persian poetry lay open in his lap, but I noticed that his eyes rarely moved across the page. Instead, those remarkable green orbs observed the comings and goings of our fellow guests with the patient intensity of a spider monitoring its web. The final pieces. At 6 o'clock, Hassan appeared with a sealed envelope that had arrived by special messenger. Poirot examined the envelope carefully before opening it, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as he read the contents. "Most illuminating, Hastings," he murmured, folding the letter with characteristic precision. "Inspector Lambert's inquiries to the Sûreté in Paris have borne fruit. It seems that Gérard Michel's business affairs were even more complex than we suspected. What have they discovered? That Michel maintained 2 sets of accounts, one for his legitimate dealings, another for his more questionable enterprises. But most interesting is the identity of his silent partner, the person who provided the financial backing for his most ambitious acquisitions." Before I could press for details, we were interrupted by the approach of Sir Charles Winter. His usual bluff demeanor had been replaced by obvious distress, and his hands trembled slightly as he lit his pipe. "Poirot," he began without preamble, "I must speak with you privately. There are matters I should have mentioned earlier but hoped would remain buried. The truth, Sir Charles, has a way of excavating itself regardless of our preferences. Perhaps it would be wise to speak now, before this evening's gathering makes such confidences more public." Sir Charles glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. My business relationship with Michel went deeper than I admitted. He didn't just sell me antiquities. He used my shipping connections to move pieces across borders. I provided the legitimate cover for his operations. And in return, exclusive access to the finest pieces, authentication services, and... Sir Charles swallowed hard. Silence about Eleanor's background. But 3 days ago, Michel demanded something more. He wanted me to use my influence to suppress an investigation by the French authorities. I refused, and he became quite threatening. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. This investigation, it concerned the Timgad excavation. Among other sites, Michel was terrified that if the authorities examined the documentation too closely, they would discover the full extent of his falsifications. He said lives would be ruined, reputations destroyed. But when I asked whose reputation he was so desperate to protect, Sir Charles paused, his face troubled. He said it wasn't his own he was worried about. The psychological gambit. As evening approached, Poirot requested that all our suspects gather in the salon for what he termed a clarification of certain details. The atmosphere was electric with tension as each person took their assigned seat, their faces bearing the strain of 3 days under suspicion. Lady Winter twisted her rings with increasing agitation, while Miss Larkin clutched her notebook like a talisman. Monsieur Delacroix appeared haggard, the attempt on his life having shattered his usual composure. Even Colonel Arbuthnot, temporarily released from custody, sat with rigid military bearing that barely concealed his underlying anxiety. Before we proceed to final revelations, Poirot began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, there is one matter that requires immediate attention. The attempt on Monsieur Delacroix's life this morning was not random. It was designed to eliminate a witness to something far more significant than mere business rivalry. He turned to address Delacroix directly. You claimed that Michel contacted you 3 days ago about a final acquisition. But that was not entirely accurate, was it? Michel contacted you because he had discovered something that threatened not just his own safety, but yours as well. Delacroix's composure cracked. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. The pottery fragments were not merely Michel's filing system. They were his insurance policy. Each piece contained evidence of specific transactions, specific falsifications. But one piece contained something far more dangerous, evidence of who had been orchestrating the entire operation from behind the scenes. The hidden truth. Poirot moved to the table where the pottery fragments lay arranged on white cloth. Consider the sophistication required for this criminal enterprise. The knowledge of archaeology, the connections to excavation sites, the ability to create convincing forgeries, the network of buyers and sellers spanning continents. Such an operation requires not just criminal cunning, but academic expertise. He picked up one particular fragment, holding it to the lamplight. This piece bears markings that are not ancient decorations, but modern notations. Field notes, written in a very distinctive hand. The hand of someone trained in archaeological documentation. Miss Larkin leaned forward, her journalistic instincts overcoming her fear. You're saying an archaeologist was behind the forgery ring? More than that. Mademoiselle, I'm saying that the person who destroyed your father's reputation was not Gérard Michel, but someone who used Michel as their instrument. Someone who needed Professor Larkin discredited because he had discovered evidence of systematic fraud in the archaeological community. The silence that followed was profound. Every face in the room bore the weight of this revelation, but one face showed something more, the dawning realization that their carefully constructed deception was finally crumbling. The trap springs. The murderer of Gérard Michel, Poirot continued with quiet authority, killed not for money or passion, but to prevent the exposure of a lifetime's work built upon fraud and deception. They killed because Michel had finally gathered enough evidence to expose the truth about who had been manipulating excavation records, falsifying provenances, and destroying honest scholars who came too close to the truth. He paused, his gaze moving systematically from face to face. "Tomorrow morning, I shall present to Inspector Lambert not merely the identity of Michel's killer, but the complete documentation of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of the archaeological establishment. Tonight, I give our murderer one final opportunity to confess, to show some small measure of the honor that their victims possessed." The challenge hung in the air like a sword. As the suspects were escorted to their rooms under discreet guard, I could see in Poirot's expression the satisfaction of a master strategist who had finally maneuvered his opponent into an impossible position. "The endgame approaches, Hastings," he murmured as we watched the last of our suspects disappear into the hotel's elegant corridors. "Tomorrow will bring either confession or final confrontation. Either way, justice will be served, and the truth, so long buried beneath layers of deception, will finally see the light." The ancient stones of Marrakesh seemed to whisper with the voices of the past, but tomorrow would bring a reckoning that would echo far beyond these desert walls, into the halls of universities and museums where truth and falsehood had become dangerously intertwined. The trap was set. The murderer now faced their final, desperate choice. The night passed with agonizing slowness, the ancient stones of Marrakesh seeming to hold their breath as justice approached on silent feet. Sleep eluded most of our party, and I found myself wandering the hotel corridors at midnight, drawn by restlessness toward the courtyard, where a familiar figure sat in contemplation. Poirot was arranged beside the fountain with characteristic precision, 3 pottery fragments laid out before him on the marble table like pieces of a chess game approaching its endgame. The moonlight silvered the water and cast deep shadows across his face, giving him an almost ethereal quality as he studied the evidence with unwavering concentration. "You are restless, Hastings," he observed, without lifting his gaze from the fragments. "I should think I am. Tomorrow you promise revelations, yet tonight you sit here playing with pottery shards, like some ancient oracle reading the future in broken crockery." A slight smile touched his lips. "Not the future, mon ami, but the past. These fragments speak more eloquently than any witness. Observe." He touched the first piece with delicate precision. This one, found clutched in Michel's hand, was meant to direct our attention toward Kandahar, toward the colonel's military history. A perfect misdirection. He moved to the second fragment. This bears the true markings, not ancient decorations, but modern notations. A filing system disguised as archaeological specimens. Michel was cleverer than anyone suspected. He documented every transaction, every forgery, every life destroyed by his criminal enterprise. And the third. The third tells us who created the system, the handwriting, the archaeological notation style, the specific knowledge required. All point to someone with advanced academic training, someone who understood that the greatest frauds are built upon foundations of legitimate expertise. The discovery. Our conversation was interrupted by Hassan's urgent approach across the moonlit courtyard. The young concierge carried himself with unusual purpose, his face grave in the lamplight. "Monsieur Poirot," he whispered, glancing nervously toward the hotel's upper floors, "I have discovered something that may be important. When I was cleaning the guest rooms this evening, I found this hidden beneath the carpet in one of the suites." He produced a small leather portfolio, its contents protected by oilcloth wrapping. Inside lay a collection of documents that made Poirot's eyes sharpen with immediate interest. Correspondence bearing university letterheads, excavation reports with suspicious alterations, and, most damning of all, a series of photographs showing the same artifacts in different settings, with different provenances attributed to each. "The documentation of 30 years of systematic fraud," Poirot murmured, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. "Each piece of correspondence shows how legitimate archaeological finds were supplemented with forgeries, how excavation reports were altered to support false conclusions, how honest scholars were discredited when they questioned suspicious discoveries." One photograph in particular caught his attention, a group portrait from what appeared to be an academic conference dated 15 years earlier. Among the distinguished faces, I recognized several of our current suspects, though they appeared younger and bore different expressions of ambition rather than the current masks of fear and guilt. "Hassan," Poirot said quietly, "in which room did you discover this portfolio?" The young man's answer sent a chill through the warm night air, confirming suspicions that had been building in Poirot's methodical mind throughout our investigation. The psychological web. "The murderer grows desperate," Poirot observed, as Hassan departed with instructions to inform Inspector Lambert of the discovery. "They realize that their carefully constructed deception is crumbling. The attempt on Delacroix's life was not merely to eliminate a witness, but to create chaos, to muddy the waters of our investigation with a second crime." He rose from his chair and began pacing the courtyard with restless energy. "But desperation breeds mistakes, Hastings. Tonight, our killer has revealed themselves through their own actions. The hidden portfolio was not abandoned by accident. It was meant to be found, to direct suspicion toward yet another innocent party. Another false trail. Precisely. But this time, the misdirection itself becomes evidence. You see, only one person in our little circle possessed both the knowledge to create such convincing false documentation and the desperation to sacrifice it as a final gambit. The fountain's gentle murmur seemed to underscore the gravity of his words. Somewhere above us, behind darkened windows, a murderer lay awake knowing that dawn would bring either successful escape or final exposure. The trap springs shut. As if summoned by our conversation, a figure emerged from the hotel's main entrance, one of our suspects moving with the careful stealth of someone who believed themselves unobserved. Poirot pressed us both back into the shadows as we watched this midnight exodus, noting the small suitcase carried with practiced quiet, the frequent glances toward the hotel's upper floors. "Flight," Poirot whispered with satisfaction. "The final confirmation of guilt. Our murderer believes that by abandoning the game board, they can escape the consequences of their moves. But they have underestimated the reach of justice." Within minutes, Inspector Lambert's officers had been quietly alerted. The attempted escape was intercepted at the hotel's main gate, the small suitcase revealing not only personal effects, but also additional evidence, vials of chemicals, forged documentation, and most tellingly, a detailed plan for assuming yet another false identity in a distant country. The final gambit. As dawn broke over the ancient city, Poirot stood once again in the courtyard, but now his expression carried the weight of complete knowledge. The pottery fragments remained on the marble table, but they had served their purpose. Not as ancient artifacts, but as the keys that unlocked a conspiracy spanning decades. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, he announced to the assembled suspects who had been roused by the night's dramatic events, "we shall gather in the salon for the final revelation. I shall present not merely the identity of Michel's murderer, but the complete solution to a web of deception that has destroyed careers, ruined reputations, and ultimately claimed a life." His green eyes moved systematically across each face, noting the various expressions of fear, resignation, and desperate hope. "The little grey cells have done their work, mes amis. The pattern is complete, the motive clear, the method established. Justice, so long delayed, will finally be served." The ancient stones of Marrakesh seemed to echo with the weight of secrets finally coming to light. As our suspects were escorted back to their rooms under discreet surveillance, I realized that Hercule Poirot had orchestrated not merely an investigation, but a complex psychological drama designed to force the truth from the most carefully guarded conscience. "The game ends tomorrow, Hastings," he murmured as we watched the last of the suspects disappear into the hotel's elegant corridors. "And when it does, the archaeological world will learn that the greatest treasure of all, truth itself, cannot be forged, no matter how skilled the craftsman or how desperate their need. The trap was set, the evidence assembled, and the murderer's final gambit had failed. Tomorrow would bring the revelation that would echo far beyond the sands of Marrakesh, into the halls of universities and museums, where the line between authentic discovery and elaborate deception had become fatally blurred. The salon had been arranged with ceremonial precision, chairs forming a perfect semicircle facing the marble fireplace, where morning light fell clean and merciless through the tall windows. The pottery fragments lay arranged on a small table beside Poirot, those deceptively modest shards that had become the key to unlocking 30 years of deception. Inspector Lambert stood near the door with 2 uniformed officers, his notebook ready to record the final chapter of our investigation. Our suspects took their places with the resigned air of players in a drama approaching its inevitable conclusion. Colonel Arbuthnot still bearing the wounded dignity of false accusation. Lady Winter, pale and trembling. Monsieur Delacroix, hollow-eyed from his brush with death. And Miss Larkin, her journalist's notebook clutched like a talisman against the approaching storm. The methodical revelation. Poirot rose with characteristic precision, his green eyes surveying the assembled faces with the calm authority of a judge preparing to deliver sentence. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "we have journeyed together through a labyrinth of false leads and carefully constructed illusions. A man lies dead, Gérard Michel, dealer in antiquities and keeper of dangerous secrets. Another man sits wrongly accused. An attempt has been made upon a second life. It is time we restored order to this chaos of deception." He moved to the table where the evidence lay displayed. Our investigation began with what appeared to be a simple crime. A man poisoned in a crowded bazaar shop with multiple suspects present and numerous motives apparent. But this surface simplicity concealed layers of fraud that reached back decades and touched the very foundations of archaeological scholarship. Poirot lifted the pottery fragment found in Michel's hand. This piece was meant to direct our attention toward Kandahar, toward military secrets and Colonel Arbuthnot's service record. A perfect misdirection, designed to satisfy official justice while the true murderer escaped unnoticed. The web of evidence. "Consider the sophistication required for this crime," Poirot continued, beginning to pace with measured steps. The murderer needed intimate knowledge of Michel's documentation system, these pottery fragments that served as a portable filing cabinet for decades of criminal activity. They needed access to sophisticated poisons and the knowledge to use them effectively. Most importantly, they needed the desperation born of knowing that Michel possessed evidence capable of destroying not just a reputation, but an entire life's work. He paused before Sir Charles, whose usual bluff demeanor had been replaced by a mask of carefully controlled tension. The attempt on Monsieur Delacroix's life was not a separate crime, but a continuation of the same plan. Delacroix knew too much about the early days of the forgery operation. He could identify the person who had been orchestrating the fraud from its very beginning. Inspector Lambert leaned forward, his pen poised above his notebook. "You're suggesting the murderer was the original architect of the scheme?" "Précisément," Poirot replied. "For 30 years, we have been told that Gérard Michel was a criminal who corrupted honest scholars. But the truth is far more complex. Michel was never the mastermind. He was the instrument of someone far more clever, someone who possessed both the academic credentials to create convincing forgeries and the social position to authenticate them without question. The hidden academic." Poirot turned to face Sir Charles directly. "You have presented yourself to us as a successful industrialist who collected antiquities as a hobby. But your knowledge of archaeological techniques, your familiarity with excavation procedures, your intimate understanding of authentication processes, these suggest a far deeper involvement in the academic world than you have admitted." Sir Charles's face had grown pale, but his voice remained steady. I've always been interested in history, Poirot. That hardly makes me a criminal. No, monsieur, but your doctorate in classical archaeology from Oxford does make you uniquely qualified to orchestrate the most sophisticated fraud in modern archaeological history. Poirot produced a document from his jacket. Inspector Lambert's inquiries to British universities revealed that Charles Winter was indeed a promising young scholar 30 years ago, until questions arose about the authenticity of his doctoral research on Romano-British artifacts. The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the assembled group. Lady Winter gasped, her handkerchief pressed to her lips, while Miss Larkin scribbled furiously in her notebook. The original partnership. You left academia under a cloud of suspicion, Poirot continued relentlessly. But you had formed a partnership with a young Gerard Michel, who possessed the connections and moral flexibility you needed to continue your work. Together, you created a system of fraud that spanned continents. You provided the academic expertise and authentication, while Michel handled the logistics of moving objects and finding buyers. Sir Charles's composure finally began to crack. You're constructing fantasies, Poirot. You have no proof of any of this. On the contrary, I have considerable proof. Poirot gestured to the evidence table. The receipt for aconitine, purchased in Paris under your academic title, a title you still use for certain transactions. The testimony of the potter who created the false fragments on your specific instructions. The handwriting analysis showing that the archaeological notations on these shards match perfectly with your field notes from 20 years ago. The fatal meeting. But most damning of all, Poirot's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We have the testimony of Ben Salah regarding the third teacup. 3 cups prepared for 3 guests, Michel, the shopkeeper, and a third man described as an English gentleman, older, with expensive clothes, who paid in gold sovereigns. Poirot moved closer to Sir Charles, his eyes blazing with intellectual triumph. You arranged to meet Michel at the shop under the pretense of negotiating the return of the incriminating evidence. But Michel had grown too dangerous. He possessed complete documentation of your 30-year partnership, evidence that would not only destroy your reputation, but expose you to criminal prosecution. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Poirot continued. While Ben Salah was fetching sugar from the storeroom, you slipped the aconitine into Michael's tea. Then, as he died, you placed the Kandahar fragment in his hand, a piece you had specifically prepared to direct suspicion toward Colonel Arbuthnot. The frame-up. Revealed. The colonel made a perfect scapegoat, Poirot observed. His military background, his connection to the Kandahar incident, his volatile temperament, all made him an ideal candidate for official justice. You planted the poison bottle in his room, along with military documents that would support the blackmail theory. Colonel Arbuthnot's face had gone from pale to red with suppressed fury. You used me, Winter. You destroyed an innocent man's reputation to save your own neck. But the plan began to unravel, Poirot continued, when Monsieur Delacroix showed signs of breaking under pressure. He knew too much about the early partnership, about how the system really worked. So, you attempted to poison him as well, using crude arsenic this time, a desperate measure that revealed your growing panic. The psychological motive, the tragedy of this case, Poirot reflected sadly, is that it began with genuine scholarly passion. You loved archaeology, Sir Charles. You wanted to contribute to human knowledge. But when your early work was questioned, when your reputation was threatened, you chose the path of deception rather than accept failure. Sir Charles's mask finally slipped completely, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and despair. You don't understand. I made genuine contributions to the field. My interpretations were correct, even if some of the supporting evidence was enhanced. The academic world is built on interpretation, on constructing narratives from fragments. I simply controlled the narrative more directly. By destroying honest scholars like Professor Larkin when they questioned your methods, Miss Larkin interjected, her voice sharp with long-suppressed fury. Larkin was a fool, Sir Charles snarled. He couldn't see the larger picture. Sometimes the truth needs assistance to reveal itself. The final evidence. Poirot produced the leather portfolio discovered by Hassan. These documents detail every aspect of your 30-year fraud. Excavation reports altered by your hand. Photographs showing the same artifacts with different provenances. Correspondence proving your partnership with Michel. And most damning of all, the record of how you systematically destroyed the careers of honest archaeologists who came too close to exposing your methods. Inspector Lambert stood, signaling his officers. Sir Charles Winter, I arrest you for the murder of Gerard Michel, the attempted murder of Armand Delacroix, and conspiracy to commit fraud on an international scale. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Sir Charles looked around the room with the wild eyes of a man watching his world collapse. Michel was going to destroy everything, he whispered. 30 years of work, of contributions to human knowledge. He deserved to die. Justice and reflection. As Sir Charles was led away, still protesting his innocence and the value of his contributions, a profound silence settled over the salon. Lady Winter wept quietly, comforted by Miss Larkin, whose father's reputation had finally been vindicated. Colonel Arbuthnot sat with military bearing restored, the weight of false accusation lifted from his shoulders. Monsieur Delacroix looked toward the window, perhaps contemplating a future free from the shadows of complicity. Poirot watched the departure of the prisoner with characteristic composure, then moved to arrange the pottery fragments in a neat line on the table. "It is always the same, Hastings," he murmured as we stood alone in the salon. "The desire to be remembered, to leave a mark upon history, can lead to the most desperate measures. Sir Charles believed he could bury the truth as easily as one buries pottery shards in the sand." He straightened his tie with precise movements. "But truth, mon ami, has a remarkable persistence. Like these ancient fragments, it may be buried, broken, scattered, but it endures. And sooner or later, someone comes along who insists on seeing things exactly as they are, not as we wish them to be." Epilogue. The afternoon sun cast long golden rays across the ancient city of Marrakesh as we prepared for our departure. Our holiday had been anything but restful, yet as I observed Hercule Poirot calmly packing his immaculate wardrobe, I knew that for him there could be no greater satisfaction than the restoration of order to a chaotic world. "The little grey cells are content, Hastings," he said with a slight smile. "Justice has been served. Truth has been revealed, and the innocent have been vindicated. What more can one ask of a holiday in Morocco?" As our car pulled away from the Hotel Palais d'Orient, I caught one last glimpse of the ancient Medina where our drama had unfolded. The stones that had witnessed centuries of human ambition and folly would continue their patient vigil long after our small story was forgotten. But for a few brief days, they had served as the stage for Hercule Poirot's particular brand of justice, methodical, implacable, and ultimately triumphant over even the most sophisticated deception. The sands of Marrakesh had yielded their secrets at last, and once again, the little Belgian detective had proven that no mystery, however complex, could withstand the relentless application of logic, observation, and those remarkable little grey cells.